She walked off the most famous court in tennis, making the shape of a heart with her hands, and she had just lost. Sit with that for 1 second, because nothing about that image makes sense until you understand what happened in the 2 hours before it. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why a Wimbledon crowd fell in love with a 21-year-old ranked outside the top 30, why the woman who actually won the match walked away with no regrets at all, and why what happened on that grass court on July 6th. 2026 might be remembered as the exact afternoon everything changed for Philippine tennis. But here's the part nobody is telling you, the part buried underneath every headline about this match, the part that turns this from a simple win or lose story into something a lot stranger and a lot more human. Stay with me, because the twist in this story is not who won. It is what the crowd did in the middle of the match, the moment the entire stadium seemed to make a decision before either player had even served for it. And I promise you, once you see that moment, you will not be able to unsee it. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who wants sports stories told properly, with the real context and not just a highlight reel, do one thing for me right now. Hit that subscribe button, because there's a version of this channel where you catch this story late, after everyone else has already talked about it. And there's a version where you're already here, already ahead of it, watching it unfold in real time with people who actually care about getting it right. I am building that second version, and I would love for you to be part of it before this video is even over, because trust me, the ending of the story is not written yet, and neither is the next chapter, which we're going to talk about later in this very video. So let's go back to the afternoon of July 6th, 2026, Center Court, Wimbledon. The chairs are the same dark green. They always are. The temperature sits around 31 degrees. Two women walk out onto the grass. And if you were sitting in the upper tier, you have felt something before either player did. The applause tilted. Not loudly, because Wimbledon crowds never do loud. They do something quieter and stranger. They do a fraction of a second. The cheer for the 21-year-old from the Philippines started a beat sooner and lasted a beat longer than the cheer for the Italian player standing across the net from her, a woman who had reached this same final 2 years earlier. Both players felt it. Everyone in that stadium felt it. And by the time the match ended, 2 hours and 22 minutes later, the scoreboard would tell one story, and the room would insist on telling another. To understand why, you need to rewind 48 hours. 2 days earlier, on that same court, this rising Filipino player, seated 29th and ranked in the low 30s, had beaten the defending Wimbledon champion in a brutal 3-set battle. It marked the first time in the entire Open era that any player from the Philippines had reached the 4th round of a Grand Slam. By Monday morning, the highlight package on Wimbledon's own official channel had already pulled in over 1 million views, more than double what clips of some of the biggest names in the sport were getting from the same tournament. The room that showed up to watch her play her next match already knew exactly who she was. Now here's where I need you to slow down with me, because this is the part the clickbait versions of this story get wrong. The Italian player did not lose because of the crowd. She did not lose at all in her own head that afternoon. She won the match 6-4 for 6, 6-3. She reached her first Grand Slam quarterfinal in 2 years. She thanked her idol, watching from the royal box, in her on-court interview. There is no footage of her glaring at the crowd. There is no quote of regret. What actually happened is far more interesting than a villain turning bitter. Before the match had even started, she had already said publicly that she expected this crowd to be behind her opponent. She saw it coming. She named it out loud, and she walked into it anyway. This is not a story about a beloved champion being betrayed by a crowd that used to adore her. It is a story about a stadium that, for one single afternoon, decided to adopt somebody else, and both women knew it before the first serve was even struck. One major outlet described the atmosphere as partisan and called it, and this is an important word, unusual given how popular the Italian player already was there. That single word tells you everything. She was not disliked. She was beloved. 2 years earlier, this exact crowd had fallen for her personality during her run to that same final. She had equity on that court. And for one round, on one day, that equity got quietly outvoted by a 21-year-old who had spent the previous 2 days becoming a phenomenon. So what did the crowd actually do moment by moment? It cheered when the younger player looked tense in her very first service game. and she held serve anyway. It stayed patient as her first serve started missing more often than it landed. It watched her lose the opening set and refused to give up on her. Then, right at the start of the second set, when she was staring down break points and somehow clawed her way back, saved the danger, broke serve, and built a lead of her own, the entire stadium finally let itself go. Chants of encouragement rolled down from the stands in a way that Wimbledon almost never allows itself. That is the sound we are actually talking about when people talk about this match. Not a betrayal, a recognition. And here is a number that should stop you in your tracks, because this did not just happen in one stadium. It was already happening everywhere. By that Monday morning, the highlight video of her win over the defending champion had pulled in more than 1,200,000 views on Wimbledon's own channel. More than double the numbers of the most famous names in tennis were pulling from the exact same tournament. Whatever was happening inside that stadium had already spread across the entire internet, and the people sitting in those seats were, in a strange way, simply confirming what millions of people online had already decided over the weekend. Career prize money still under $1 million. Meanwhile, the woman across the net had already reached a French Open final and a Wimbledon final on her resume. And even with all of that experience, even with all of that history on that exact court, the crowd still chose the other one. Not because anyone did anything wrong. Because one player had just done something the seats could not stop replaying. Add in the head-to-head between them. Because it explains why the more experienced player walked out wary that day. Their only previous meeting had come earlier that same season, at a major hard-court event, and the younger player had won it comfortably, sending her more decorated opponent out in an early round. On camera, you can watch the two of them embrace afterward with real warmth. That is not manufactured rivalry. That is respect. And it meant that walking onto center court this time, the more experienced player already knew she had lost to this opponent before, and knew the crowd was not going to carry her the way it usually did. She won anyway. That detail matters, because it is a part of the story a lazy headline erases completely. Now let us slow down inside that second set, because this is where the emotional center of the whole afternoon actually lives. And it is not a single flashy shot. It is something quieter. The younger player saved 3 break points early in that set. Then she broke back. Then she served it out to level the match at 1 set apiece. At that exact point, the two players had won almost the exact same number of total points across the entire match, separated by a single point after nearly 90 minutes of tennis. And that is the moment the crowd made noise loud enough that you could hear it through a television speaker on the other side of the world. The moment the stadium realized this match was going to decide her, and it let itself want something out loud. Thousands of people in those seats had bought their tickets weeks or months earlier, most of them with zero personal connection to the Philippines. What they were doing in real time was choosing. They were watching a player almost none of them had heard a year earlier, and deciding together out loud that they wanted her to win. That is an extraordinary thing for a Wimbledon crowd to do this early in someone's career. It almost never happens. But tennis does not care about sentiment, and grass does not forgive forever. In the third set, the mechanics finally caught up with the moment. At 3-all in the decider, a string of errors crept in, and she was broken. Her opponent, meanwhile, found something in her own game that had been missing for most of the match. Her first serve percentage climbing dramatically in that final stretch, and she closed it out. 2 hours and 22 minutes after it began, the match was over, and this is where the story either becomes a cheap headline or becomes something worth actually remembering, and it depends entirely on what both women said afterward. The winner, in her on-court interview, talked about how tough the match had been, how it felt like a roller coaster, how there were difficult stretches, and how she leaned on her team to get through it. She talked about loving what she does and calling it her own superpower. That is not the language of someone leaving the court bitter about how a crowd behaved. That is the language of someone who has already made peace with a very specific Wimbledon truth, that this particular stadium picks whoever it wants to pick, and her job is simply to play tennis regardless. Now listen what the 21-year-old said afterward, because this is the sentence that explains exactly why that crowd chose her in the first place. She talked about giving everything on every single point. When asked about her serve, the part of her game that had abandoned her at the worst possible moment, she did not make an excuse. She said in her own words that her serve was not where it usually was that day, but that everyone has days like that, and she does not expect to play her best tennis every single time out. And then she said something close to this. That, of course, there were things she would have done differently, but that is tennis, and that is also what makes the sport beautiful. Stadiums respond to composure like that. Rooms fall for a 21-year-old who has just lost the biggest match of her career and can still, in one sentence, tell you what she loves about the exact sport that beat her that day. Now zoom out, because the scale of what happened here deserves to be said plainly. She became the first player from the Philippines to reach the fourth round of a Grand Slam anywhere in the entire Open era, a stretch of tennis history going back to 1968. That is 58 years without a single Filipino name reaching that stage of a major tournament. Back home, the country's own president publicly praised her, and watch parties were organized around the Philippines just to follow this one match. And this is not only a national story anymore. It went global the moment that highlight video